History as it happens, September 14th, 2023. What if? Kennedy and Vietnam.
Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though in battle we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle.
We withdrew from Vietnam. The communists would control Vietnam. Pretty soon, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaya would go.
Worked very closely together in the National Security Council in the last 2 months to meet the problems we faced in South Vietnam.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting.
As the 60th anniversary of his assassination approaches, a question still hangs over John F. Kennedy's legacy. Had he lived, would he have withdrawn from Vietnam? It's a tantalizing counterfactual, not only because LBJ's escalation led to epic tragedy, but because of the lessons we can apply to our foreign policy dilemmas today. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I think, like a good politician, Kennedy was keeping his options open when he left for Texas. Had not made a final decision on what should happen in Vietnam. It's possible, and I want to underscore this, I would say maybe even likely, and I want to underscore that he had decided in his own mind that he was never going to make this a large-scale American war. That he had already decided, as he said in early September, this is their war, they're going to have to win it. In that same interview, by the way, he also said it would be a mistake for the U.S. to withdraw.
Monday, November 4th, 1963. Over the weekend, the coup in Saigon took place. Culminated 3 months of...
3 days before President Kennedy recorded this personal memo in the White House, South Vietnam's generals toppled the autocratic regime of Ngo Dinh Diem in Saigon. Diem and his brother Nhu were murdered the following day.
I was shocked by the death of Diem and Nhu. I'd met Diem with Justice Douglas many years
Their
ago.
deaths weighed on the president's conscience as he expressed misgivings about more or less acquiescing in Diem's removal.
I feel that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of early August, in which we suggested the coup. Period, in my judgment, that wire was badly drafted. Comment should never have been sent on a Saturday. I should not have given my consent to it without a roundtable conference in which McNamara and Taylor could have presented their views.
18 days later, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald. And since that day, the question of what JFK would have done in Vietnam has been the subject of endless historical debate. And historians now have access to an extensive documentary record of the Kennedy administration's private deliberations. Some facts are indisputable. President Kennedy was committed to helping South Vietnam in its fight against the communist insurgency. But he opposed sending in U.S. ground forces, as he told CBS's Walter Cronkite in a wide-ranging interview in early September 1963. The U.S. would help with advisors, but the war was Saigon's to win or lose. He also said U.S. withdrawal would be a great mistake.
But these people who say that we ought to withdraw from Vietnam are wholly wrong, because if we withdrew from Vietnam, the communists would control Vietnam. Pretty soon, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaya would go, and all of Southeast Asia would be under the control of the communists and under the domination of the Chinese. And then India, Burma would be the next target. So I think we should stay. We should make it clear, as Ambassador Lodge is now making it clear, that while we want to help, we don't see a successful ending to this war unless the people will support it. And the people will not support the effort if the government continues to follow the policy of the past 2 months.
Yet, since mid-1962, withdrawal planning led by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara had been underway, with the aim of bringing 1,000 U.S. personnel home by the end of 1963, and the entire U.S. advisory presence by the end of 1965. But that ambitious or unrealistic timeline depended on progress in the war, and as 1963 wore on, there wasn't as much progress to report. The year began with an alarming development at the Battle of Ap-Back, where 5 American helicopters were shot down. In this audio clip, which is available at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, go to millercenter.org to see this invaluable resource. In this clip, just days after Ap-Back, Secretary McNamara is briefing Kennedy on supposed progress in the fight against the Viet Cong. But he says there are a number of disquieting indications the Viet Cong were growing stronger anyway.
There are a number of disquieting indications of possible trouble to come. In the first place, the Viet Cong continued to be able to recruit additional personnel and in numbers at least sufficient to offset their losses. As a matter of fact, there are some indications that the total strength of the Viet Cong, despite very large casualty rate, is increasing slightly.
Later that year, October 1963, at a meeting of the National Security Council, Kennedy questioned the wisdom of publicly committing to an American troop withdrawal. Again, the source is the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. If the war doesn't continue to go well, said the president. Well, up to the day he died, John Kennedy was not convinced the time had come to abandon Saigon to itself. There were still some 16,000 U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam. But this does not mean Kennedy would have escalated the war either. Maybe, after winning re-election the following year, he would have seen the situation as hopeless and wound down the U.S. presence in Vietnam. It's impossible to know for sure, but this counterfactual scenario isn't merely academic. Think of the issues involved here and how they apply to our current problems. What is the meaning of U.S. credibility? Is it possible to achieve positive outcomes through the use of military force? What is the difference between vital and peripheral interests? How does a conflict in one part of the world affect conflicts elsewhere? Is every conflict part of a larger struggle? Is it possible to disengage from any part of the world without suffering negative political consequences at home? This is the first in what will be an occasional series of What If podcasts. And I want to mention a number of books that helped inform my approach here. First, The Kennedy Withdrawal by Mark Silverstone at the aforementioned Miller Center at the University of Virginia. Also, Choosing War, The Lost Chance for Peace and the Escalation of War in Vietnam, by Harvard's Fredrik Logevall. He is also the author of Embers of War, The Fall of an Empire and the Making of America's Vietnam, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Professor Logevall is now in the process of writing the second in his 2-volume biography of JFK. Fred Logevall, welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, it's good to be with you.
Well, it's great to see you. It's been a couple of years, and I don't know if congratulations are in order, but you are my first guest here in what will be an occasional series of episodes about what-if scenarios. What if Kennedy in Vietnam? You know, I'm always talking about counterfactuals to one degree or another. I mean, it's inevitable when you're doing a podcast like this. But I think counterfactuals are useful, not because they help us say definitively what should have happened or could have happened, but they help us understand what actually did happen, what options were available to decision makers at the time. How do you approach counterfactuals as a historian?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I think a lot of my fellow historians, academics that is, because I think there is a distinction to be made here between those who are, shall we say, professional historians and those who aren't. Many of them are skeptical of this. They say we have enough difficulty figuring out what did happen in history. Let's not waste our time on what might have happened. But I'm with you on this. I think that it's more than a parlor game. I think it actually helps us better understand what did happen in history, as you just said. I think that's correct. Pedagogically speaking, it's fantastic in the sense that students love to think about this and to ponder what might have been. And finally, I guess I would say, I do think there are certain ground rules that one should follow, but if one follows those, I think they have real utility. Anytime we're talking about causality in history, whether we're admitting it or not, we're considering alternatives. unrealized alternatives. So really, in a sense, what you're suggesting and what I'm suggesting is let's bring them to the fore and consider them carefully. Know that we can never have a conclusive answer, but in a sense, I believe, enhance historical understanding.
And an important point you make in the beginning of your excellent book that I have here, Choosing War, is we have to assess the role of individual decision-making and contingency in history. Because if we only look at larger historical forces, well, then every single outcome seems inevitable.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that Vietnam is a great example because there are structural forces, no question. There are subterranean currents that bring us large-scale war in Vietnam. I would never deny that for a minute. But in terms of explanatory power, I just think it's limited. And so we also have to, as you just said, we also have to think about human agency and the role that it played, contingency, as you say. You have both here. And I do think in terms of key decisions made in France during the French War, in Vietnam itself, both North and South, in Washington, it's individual decision makers who are often making absolutely critical decisions about what's going to happen, and we have to explore those.
Vietnam in particular is important, not just in the abstract, because we continue to apply Vietnam to our current foreign policy dilemmas. I mean, this has some real value here. For instance, the meaning of U.S. credibility. What if Biden hadn't pulled American forces out of Afghanistan? Differentiating between vital and peripheral interests. You get my point. So, framing local conflicts within a global war, for instance, a global struggle against autocracy. I mean, you can see all of this in the debates about what to do in Vietnam in 63, 64, 65, right?
Oh, no question. One doesn't want to draw a straight line necessarily between, say, Vietnam 1963 under Kennedy and what Joe Biden is considering today. But I think you're quite right to say that there are echoes. And this question of credibility is just of eternal importance in a couple of the classes. In the classes that I teach here at Harvard, we spend time on this. How important is credibility really? Policymakers invariably invoke it. That is to say, U.S. credibility is on the line. If we don't do X, Y, or Z, our adversaries will no longer respect us. Our allies will no longer feel like they can depend on us. Is this true? I think the scholarship suggests we should be, to say the least, skeptical of this idea, which is to say credibility generally matters less than decision makers like to say. Another way of looking at this is to think of credibility in three terms, if you will. Credibility cubed, I've called it, which is to say American credibility on the international stage, domestic or shall we say partisan credibility at home, and third, personal credibility, careerist credibility, or in terms of historical legacy. And that helps. And I often find, certainly with respect to topics like Vietnam, that it's, in my judgment, more the domestic credibility and the personal credibility that looms larger for me than this question of America's reputation, America's credibility, America's prestige on the global stage.
You've made the most convincing argument about the role of credibility related to the dominoes, that you say by the mid-1960s, credibility is a much more important idea in the decision makers' minds than falling dominoes.
Yeah, I think it's true. And Jonathan Schell, the journalist, had a nice phrase for this. He referred to a psychological domino theory. And what he meant by that is that it's no longer by the time we get into the early 1960s. It's no longer a concern about particular countries falling one by one in a geographic kind of fashion, but it's a psychological concern about how, again, adversaries and allies around the world will respond should the United States be perceived as having not lived up to its commitment in South Vietnam. So there's a shift, if you will, from a kind of strict domino theory concern under Eisenhower. He made this notion famous in a press conference in 1954, that if one domino falls, the others will also fall. Less of a concern about that and more of this kind of nebulous psychological concern. Even there, as I suggested a moment ago, I think we can exaggerate, or we should avoid exaggerating how much it actually drove decision-making. And more importantly, how much both adversaries and allies would conclude, what they would conclude from an American decision, either to escalate or to find some kind of fig leaf negotiated settlement out of, in this case, Vietnam.
I think this what if also remains tantalizing for a very simple, significant reason. That is, if Kennedy, again, this is a counterfactual, if Kennedy had lived and withdrawn U.S. forces from Vietnam, our country would have avoided an enormous tragedy, something that maybe Mr. Putin should have considered before ordering the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That, using the military to obtain or achieve desired outcomes in international relations. It failed in Vietnam. It's continued to fail since. I guess I don't know how much world leaders have actually learned that lesson, but it still hangs over our heads, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. A real question for the scholar becomes, and this will be a question for scholars of Putin's decision-making, question becomes, what was being considered at the time? In other words, were there voices, were there people in the Kennedy administration or outside the administration, but people of influence? So, prominent journalists, leaders in allied governments, for example. Were there people in 1962, 63 saying, we don't have to do this. And if we do it, that is to say, escalate, we can expect to pay a price. We're not sure that this is going to go well. We have other options. If you as a historian can find that, in fact, this discussion was going on, then it seems to me to add important weight to the counterfactual. Because it's not simply you saying after the fact, when the results are clear, oh, if only Kennedy had seen that this was going to be a disaster, if only he had acted on this in a different way. It's more than that now. You're actually having evidence to show that even at the time, there were doubts. Even at the time, a different path was being proposed. So that's key.
Even if it were impossible for them at the time to foresee the full extent of the disaster to come, they had questions about it, and not just in the 1960s. As I learned from reading your book, Embers of War, another superb book, if you don't mind my saying, John Kennedy in the 1950s, he visited Southeast Asia, and he said, there's something to these wars of national liberation, in his view, that the U.S. had to respect, even though in this case it was a communist war for national liberation.
Yeah, no, it's just remarkable, Martin, the degree to which the young Kennedy, who first visited in 1951 with his brother Robert and their sister Patricia, so right at the sort of zenith, if you will, of the French War, they visit Indochina, and he writes at the time, and then comments publicly upon his return to Boston of the problems that the French are encountering. He implies this is not going to work. You're not going to be able to stop Ho's revolution through military means. And by extension, I think John F. Kennedy is saying any Western power, including the United States, is going to have this kind of difficulty. And so there is a kind of paradox, which I'm going to have to develop in volume 2 of my Kennedy biography, which I'm writing as we speak. A paradox. Kennedy has these doubts, turn out to be prescient doubts. I don't think they go away in the latter part of the 1950s, even as he mutes this perspective, if I can put it that way, as he becomes a more orthodox Cold Warrior, partly, I think, to get the nomination in 1960 and then to win in 1960. I don't think the doubts go away, but the paradox is this same Kennedy, as president during his 1,000 days in office, expands U.S. involvement quite significantly. And that's something you and I, I'm sure, are going to talk about here. But I have to grapple with what I see as this paradox, because as you say, he is foreseeing these problems from a very early point.
Those are some of the subterranean currents you mentioned. Once you're in charge, now it's on your plate. You're responsible for it. You're the president. You've already campaigned criticizing the prior administration for not being, whatever, tough enough on communism or whatever he may have said about Eisenhower. Mark Silverstone, in his book, The Kennedy Withdrawal, another volume that helped inform my questions for this conversation, he dedicates his epilogue to how conversations about Kennedy in Vietnam have changed over time, in part because of what you're dealing with now as you write your books about Kennedy, your biography. The Kennedy mystique. Had he lived, he would have saved us from this disaster.
Yeah. Well, Mark's book is a very fine book, very authoritative. He worked on it for a long time, and he has extraordinary access to the key materials. And so I heartily recommend that book. I'm glad you mentioned it. Yes, I think there's something to this, for sure. This mystique and this idea that if only he had lived, we would have avoided not only this problem, that is to say, a bloody and extended war and ultimately futile war in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but we would have avoided all kinds of other problems. And again, something I have to grapple with in my current book project. And I can see, I think we can all see why people would latch onto this idea. What we really need to do as historians, and what Mark does in his book, is to go in and look and see what the evidence actually says about Kennedy's decisions, and of course, ultimately about his plans. What was he really thinking about the war when he left on that fateful final trip to Texas? What were his intentions? As you pointed out a moment ago, it's one thing when you're in the wings to criticize policy decisions, but when you're in charge, when you're in the Oval Office, what are you actually going to do? And so this is the key task for those of us who are studying this extraordinary person, his presidency, and in this case, what's going on in Southeast Asia, both during his 1,000 days and in terms of what he might have intended to do had he returned from Dallas alive.
What a powerful statement it would have been for a U.S. president to say, you know what, we don't need this small country on the other side of the world. We're going to get to that.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
It's a really interesting point. And my own view on that question is that Kennedy, had he made that statement, had he said something like this: we've fulfilled our commitment to South Vietnam, and we've aided the South Vietnamese government in the following ways, but it's really up to the South Vietnamese to wage this struggle, et cetera, and perhaps reconvene the Geneva Conference, or try to bring about a convening of the Geneva Conference with Britain and the Soviet Union in charge. I think an American president would have survived that decision in political terms. And so I think a broad conclusion that I would offer is that a succession of American presidents and their advisors exaggerated the stakes. And at least at this point, which is to say up through the fall of 1963, there is maneuverability for a president. But we can get into that.
Well, doing an interview with me, Fred, and one reason why I like talking to you is that you're willing to go along like we're in a canoe on a lazy river. We'll eventually get to our destination at some point. I think what's really important here, though, is to understand the U.S. commitment to Vietnam predates Kennedy's presidency. Really, the first what if in this story is, what if FDR had lived? Would he have supported the French in its effort to regain Indochina after 1945? Maybe been done with it right there.
It's true. It's true. And I talk a little bit about this in Embers of War, that I think that presidential transition, which is to say from FDR, who after all died as a young man, he was not healthy, but it's not hard to imagine him living for another year or two or three or four. That transition between FDR and Truman is an important one, including on this topic, because FDR's aversion to put it mildly, French colonialism was deep. And so his survival in office, I suggest in the book, matters potentially. Truman, it's not that Truman was pro-colonialism, pro-French imperialism, not at all. He just didn't feel it in the same visceral way that FDR did. And the best proof of the importance of this counterfactual can be found in French archives and French materials. The French themselves worried or they pondered, or they obsessed over the following question in the summer of 1945. What will the Americans do? What will the Americans do? They were acutely worried that as the new top dog on the international stage, the United States would basically say, no, you're not going to recolonize Indochina. We're not going to go for that. This is going to become some sort of mandate that'll move Indochina toward independence. We're not going to let you do this. This was a worry among French officials themselves. And by the way, from the left side of the spectrum to the right side of the spectrum. Yeah. So I think you're right. There's a real kind of open moment in August of 1945 and through the end of that year where a different set of decisions by the Truman administration could have made a real difference. I'm not suggesting, therefore, the French would have just said, oh, okay, we're going home. But it's a meaningful question.
Well, the French needed American money to fight the war, and they've got plenty of it. Yeah. So in the interest of time, we will move ahead to January 1961. President Kennedy gives his inaugural address. The U.S. has, as I mentioned, bankrolled the French war effort, and some of what we're going to cover here you've touched on already, so it might overlap a little bit. But what was John F. Kennedy's mindset upon taking office? A cold warrior, right, on the one hand, but also, as we discussed, he had been to Southeast Asia. He looked at the situation with what Mark Silverstone refers to with a subtle eye.
Yes, I think all of that's true, including the fact that he is a cold warrior, although he's a cold warrior of a certain kind, in that what I think I show is that through the 1950s, he is cognizant of the fact that in terms of what we used to call the third world, that is to say, newly independent nations that are springing up in many parts of the world, the United States can't simply be saying, well, it's communism versus anti-communism. The United States needs to respond, Kennedy says, to the needs and to the aspirations of people in the developing world. And I think that affects his outlook on this. And so I think sometimes the inaugural address is misinterpreted as being nothing but a Cold War call to arms.
Not as a call to battle, though in battle we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself.
I think if you read the speech, it's more than that. And so I think we should bear that in mind. Nevertheless, when he takes office in 1961, to go directly to your question, he is committed to the commitment to South Vietnam that Eisenhower has really launched after the French defeat in 1954. There's a steady buildup of American support for South Vietnam in the final 6 years of the decade. And Kennedy, I think, affirms that commitment through those critical early months of his administration. He's got a lot on his plate. This is just one issue among many. And I think he believes that he should maintain that commitment to South Vietnam's independence, no question.
But he subscribes to domino thinking, which is a bit surprising considering he was able to see the situation in Laos as not a domino, right? You dealt with Laos separately from Vietnam.
Yeah, he subscribes to it and he doesn't subscribe to it. And I think the Laos example is a really good one. I sometimes say to my students, I say, if Kennedy had endorsed the recommendations by his advisors to make a military commitment to Laos, to send American air power and troops to save Laos in 1961, we might all be sitting here today talking about the inevitable American war in Laos. And so it's a useful reminder, at least to me, that a few things in history are inevitable. And in fact, Kennedy, as you know, decided against that military commitment to Laos, decided maybe the dominoes will not fall. And so I think, in fact, he was already too sophisticated in his analysis of international issues to really subscribe to a simplistic domino theory. For public purposes, I think he sometimes gave the impression that he endorsed it, including in some famous television interviews. I think privately he was skeptical. He knew that what happens in a given country depends on conditions in that country, not so much on what's happening next door. So I don't think he was actually an ardent believer really ever in the domino theory.
And it seems to me that he viewed Vietnam as not a vital interest of the United States, a peripheral one, important, but not a vital one. And when I look back on these issues and I prepare for these conversations, sometimes I have to remind myself, this was not the only thing John Kennedy was dealing with. Vietnam wasn't even really on the top of his priority list when he enters the White House, although it does quickly come to his attention, right? I mean, there were a lot of other things.
Yeah, it's true. Laos initially actually looms larger. And when Eisenhower meets with him the day before the inauguration, Eisenhower is also pressing Laos as being of primary importance. But you're quite right. If you look at the first months in 61, and indeed even certainly through the summer of 61, he's got bigger fish to fry. And he would like to keep this thing afloat, partly for domestic political reasons. We should never underestimate the importance of those domestic political reasons, as I suggested earlier. But you're quite right, Martin. It is not on the top of his priority list.
Yeah, I mean, he had a number of setbacks in his presidency that made him look, in the eyes of his critics, weak, right? We had Bay of Pigs. His interactions with Khrushchev did not always go so well. So these other incidents across the geopolitical chessboard, if you don't mind my calling it that, do color the administration's approach to Vietnam. So when does John Kennedy first begin contemplating withdrawing some or all U.S. forces from Vietnam, and why?
Well, the early thinking about this, the early articulations about this in a fairly serious way are really in the spring of 62, say broadly speaking at the midpoint of his presidency. British officials begin to be somewhat concerned about a deepening U.S. involvement. And let's note here that Kennedy has crossed an important threshold. He rejects the idea of committing ground troops to South Vietnam. He rejects the idea of a kind of overt air campaign, but he expands U.S. involvement quite significantly through the course of 1962. So that buildup has begun, and the British have some concerns. George Ball, a mid-level official in the administration, is also a bit worried about this. And then most significantly, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, at about the midpoint in 62, begins to say, well, now maybe we should be thinking here about a gradual step down in U.S. involvement. And, some people say this originates with Kennedy. I don't see good evidence for this, but Kennedy's certainly aware of this. So it's a long way of answering your question. It is really at, let's say, the midpoint of 62 that this is being discussed. It's discussed in part because it's a period of relative optimism about the state of the war.
That's a huge point, yes.
Yeah, and I think it matters, and I think it colors the thinking on this. That is to say, we're seeing progress on this, and we certainly don't want to commit more men and resources than necessary. Let's begin to think about a phased withdrawal. That's the context in mid-62.
And it seems McNamara was the chief policymaker here, with help from some others, Maxwell Taylor and others.
I think he was. And as time progresses, I think this is consistent with Mark Severstone's finding. This is certainly my own sense, and I'm going to come back to some of this as I research volume 2 of my biography. I think McNamara's thinking on this is fairly constant. He also becomes increasingly of the view that there is congressional misgivings. There are congressional misgivings. Leading voices on Capitol Hill as we get into 63 and the middle part of 63 and even into the fall are saying, well, we're not really comfortable with this. What's the plan? So he thinks that also partly for domestic political reasons, having a withdrawal plan in place makes good sense.
What struck me from reading Silverstone's book was each time, I don't want to say every time, but several times when McNamara and others bring the withdrawal plans to Kennedy, Kennedy is not impressed with them.
Yeah, no, I think he's basically saying, well, what if this is not consistent with the developments on the ground? What if we're going to be accused of being too optimistic? I think that matters a lot. And that's a point that's often understated, shall we say, by those people. And there's a sizable number of them, well-respected people who argue, as you know, that withdrawal plan had in fact been fully implemented, certainly fully initiated by the time of Kennedy's death. That not only was he intending to do this, he had started it. That certainly complicates their argument, the point that you just made.
McNamara had an idea to withdraw, but it's withdrawal, but based on the expectation the war would be going well enough that the U.S. could get its advisors out of there. There were 16,000 by the time of Kennedy's assassination, and then hand off security responsibilities to Saigon. So it's true that McNamara drew up plans to have the U.S. out of Vietnam by 1965, which might sound surprising to those who see McNamara as the chief architect of escalation. But the escalation happens because the conditions they needed to get out of there never really materialized. I think that becomes more apparent in 63 when the war's not going well.
Yeah, you make several important points there. I do think McNamara is an interesting figure in all of this. He's worthy of more study than he's received. My own view, and I think it's a minority view, I don't claim to speak for most historians. I say this even in choosing war, and I still believe it. I don't think he was ever really a true believer on this thing. Had he served a president who had determined that the right thing to do was to get out of Vietnam, I think he would have been a forceful advocate of that policy. And I think his skepticism comes through in the fall of 63. We need a way out of Vietnam. Basically, I think his position, I think he's gloomy, even if he won't admit this publicly, about the prospects in the struggle. And that's an important thing. And so I think maybe the second point I would just make in response to your excellent summary there is that, yes, it's true that for McNamara, as I think you pointed out, it's all conditioned upon the state of the war. But maybe there's a little more to it. That is to say that even there's a part of McNamara who is thinking that even if things are not going well, we've got to figure out a way to de-escalate U.S. involvement when the time comes. Is Kennedy of that same view? I think he is, which is why if we get to the discussion of what he might have done had he lived, I come down on the side that he would have, in all likelihood, have avoided a major escalation. But you're quite right to emphasize McNamara's importance.
Avoid a major escalation does not necessarily mean pull everyone out of there, because if you're going to do that, then you have to answer questions about, well, what about our credibility? And you have domestic critics at home running against you for president. What about the coups? Toppling Diem, and then the people who take over for No Dien Diem, they get toppled in a bloodless coup. To me, that speaks to Kennedy's commitment to Vietnam. He cared enough about what was going on in the government in Saigon to want the right people in charge there, even if they had to keep changing them over and over again. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think a fly in the ointment of any argument that he had actually initiated a full withdrawal before his death is the coup. Would a president who actually had made this kind of decision go through with giving the green light to coup plotters in Saigon? Since, he's no dummy, he's got to know in advance, even if he doesn't think that the Nos are going to be killed, that the two brothers are going to be killed, No Dien Diem and No Dien New, he's got to know that this is going to deepen the U.S. commitment on some level. And so it seems inconsistent with the claim that he's already made up his mind, and not only made up his mind, but initiated a withdrawal. So the coup is an issue here. I'm perfectly prepared to accept the argument that the deaths of Diem and New took him by surprise. Say he was naive, could say he should have anticipated this. But, if you listen to that remarkable recording that he makes on the 4th of November, which I play in class for my students, he seems pained by this and he seems surprised. And I'm not going to question the sincerity of his tone in that monologue.
Shocked by the death of Diem and New. I'd met Diem with Justice Douglas many years ago. He was an extraordinary character, while he became increasingly difficult in the last months. Nevertheless, over a 10-year period, he'd held his country together, maintained its independence under very adverse conditions. The way he was killed made it particularly abhorrent.
But regardless of whether he should have accepted it or not, it happened. There's no question that the coup complicates this story. None at all.
Something that's so fascinating about this counterfactual, it opens a window for us to see The nature of developing policy in real time. There was a moment there, not just a moment, several months where the U.S. officials in the Kennedy administration were worried about Saigon wanting them to get out, or there are too many advisors here. You're undermining our own credibility with our own country. It's like, depending on which point you drop in on, right, you'll find people advocating for one position or the other. Yeah.
It's really true, and it's one reason why I think that this is a perfect candidate for careful counterfactual analysis, because it meets various criteria. Number one, there's a very voluminous documentary record for what we might call the prehistory and the post-history. Prehistory being the period up through November 22nd, 1963. And we also have a very robust, equally robust, even more robust documentary record post-assassination, post-Dallas. So we can really compare them. Moreover, the players remain the same. So we don't have to change the variables. On the American side, the same people who are making decisions, apart from Kennedy himself, of course, are there both before and after. So we can, as you say, drop in and look closely at what's being said in those fateful months. I refer to the long 1964, and that begins really in the summer of 63 under Kennedy. We can drop in and even listen to tapes and see how they saw things right up to Dallas. And then, of course, see how, if at all, this changes after Lyndon Johnson becomes president. It's perfect for our purposes in terms of a careful investigation of the counterfactual.
Two more questions, Fred Logevall. I have neglected to bring up public opinion, which is a huge factor here. In a democracy, even not in a democracy, public opinion matters. Vietnam was not a big issue for Americans in 61, 62. Am I wrong about that?
No, I think you're quite right about this. I think there are people who are careful readers of the New York Times and careful readers of, Time and Newsweek and maybe international press accounts who are following what's happening in Vietnam. But in terms of ordinary Americans in the middle of the country and elsewhere, I think this is a peripheral issue at best. It's in a sense in the spring, summer of 63, as the turmoil deepens in South Vietnam. And as American reporters, David Halberstam, Neil Sheehan, others, as they begin to report on what's going on in South Vietnam, including, self-immolations by Buddhist monks, and you have a sense of deepening turmoil, it's really then, in 63, that this becomes a significant issue for most Americans. And even then, of course, it's episodic. It's really in the fall of 63, and then for the next 10 years, that Vietnam is a top drawer issue.
The Battle of Ap-Bac in early 1963 got a lot of attention.
Yes,
but,
yes. And then even then it recedes a little bit in the months thereafter, and then picks up in a more sustained way, I would say, in the summer.
Yeah, even the gloomy reports Kennedy himself was getting from different officials, ambassadors, people who took trips to Vietnam, McNamara himself, always came back, though, this isn't going our way, but we can get something out of this. We should not quit. So final question here is, what if Kennedy had lived? Maybe we can't answer that definitively. But as of November 22nd, 1963, I think we can say that John Kennedy was not committed to withdrawing all American advisors from Vietnam. I don't know where that gets us in the final analysis, but I'll leave that to you. Maybe you disagree with that.
I think that's my view as well. And as I said, there are numerous authors, and I respect them. They're serious observers of this, who see it differently, who see a full Kennedy commitment to getting out before this. I think, like a good politician, Kennedy was keeping his options open when he left for Texas, had not made a final decision on what should happen in Vietnam. It's possible, and I want to underscore this, I would say maybe even likely, and I want to underscore that he had decided in his own mind that he was never going to make this a large-scale American war, that he had already decided, as he said in early September, this is their war. They're going to have to win it. In that same interview, by the way, he also said it would be a mistake for the U.S. to withdraw.
But in the final analysis, it's the people and the government themselves who have to win or lose this struggle. All we can do is help, and we're making it very clear. But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw.
So he's keeping his options open. He's a good politician. My own sense of this, and I've written about this, including in an essay in the companion volume to the Ken Burns, Lynn Novick television documentary. There's a companion volume in which I have an essay and I address this very question. I conclude as follows, that a surviving Kennedy probably keeps Vietnam on the back burner through the 1964 election. That is to say, keeps the patient alive, maintains an American commitment to South Vietnam. And then, because I think that another reason why I think the counterfactual works is that I think we can avoid upsetting a lot of these variables. I think that Vietnam, as for Johnson, Vietnam in early 65 is going to be at a point where he has to make a firmer decision. I think at that point, Kennedy avoids a major escalation of the war. I think his skepticism went deeper than Johnson's, and Johnson had his own skepticism, but it went deeper than Johnson. He used his advisory system differently than Johnson did, and I think in a more effective way than Johnson did. Moreover, the key decision for Kennedy would have come here in his second term when he could no longer run for re-election. I think that matters, because for Johnson, in choosing Americanization, it's very much kind of his first term. He's just been reelected and he's thinking about 68, and that colors his decision-making. So for a few reasons, I have a couple of others that I articulate in this piece I mentioned, but for several different reasons, though we can never know, it seems to me that the best argument is that a surviving John F. Kennedy comes back from Dallas. I think he ultimately avoids making Vietnam a full-scale, large-scale American war.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Why are these realities our concern? Why are we in South Vietnam?
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Make sure to sign up for my newsletter at historyasithappens.com. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. My newsletter every Friday. This is a podcast from the Washington Times.